In the mythological legend, there is a character called Orchids, a libidinous son of satyr and nymph who was condemned to be devoured by wild beasts for having made love to a priestess while being drunk. His parents begged, and the gods, touched by this, immortalized him on condition that later on his future life he provides satisfaction to men. That's how he ended up being turned into an orchid.
Today we welcome all the lovers of orchids. To this beautiful program, we will have about many genders and species that live in the crops and nature of Colombia. We will explain some basic elements of growing plants that are special, and we will also talk about the reproduction of orchids, the most appropriate methods, and history about these beautiful plants.
The orchids are scattered across the globe for their color, beauty, and also the strange shapes of their flowers. That's why they stand out among other plants and cause more curiosity.
This is a plant that generates strange attraction to explain in old and young men, children and ladies. This has no distinction of sex or age. It is definitely a captivating plant that has weird sexual elements. It means it is a plant with a merged male and female reproductive system, and with it, it has been possible to make a lot of improvements as the ones we are seeing that make it one of the most important species of plants worldwide.
Because of its beauty and high cost, orchids are now a reason of a crop or for a crop leaded to individuals and companies as a cut flower or ornamental plant. That's why they have an economical importance in the world.
We can divide this wonderful world in two main aspects. The most important is that coming from this beautiful plant, a large business and also an industry that enacts the circulation of money at a worldwide level. Within the industry, we can talk about giving plants for cutting flowers. It means using the flower or otherwise to use the flowering plant to take it home and leave it for decoration or admiration of others. This group is different from what ancient orchidology is, which is the one fans of plants are into for both natural and hybrid plants, but basically for collection. Those who want to go deep for learning about special groups of orchids and also important topics as the reproduction of these plants.
Orchids rarely generate natural hybrids in wild conditions, since the integrity of the plants is kept mainly by natural barriers such as the flowering season, the floral's shape, and visual effects or scents to attract animals that encourage pollination besides genetic incompatibility among species. But what is the difference between a species and a hybrid?
We must understand and be very clear on two concepts commonly used: the term species and the term hybrid. What is a species? In this case, here we have it. This plant is a species Cattleya triana, semi-alba variety. So it is not a species found in the forests. On the contrary, it is a mutation that tends to lose the pink color and leaves only the white one. It comes anyways from the naturals. It hasn't been modified by man, so in other words, has on hybridization, and it hasn't been manipulated in a laboratory. Species, set of individuals who come from common ancestors are capable to reproduce or exchange gems among themselves, giving rise to fertile offspring. From this plant and by hybridization with other Cattleya striana or Cattleyas like the Varsevixi or Laviata, one can get to develop very interesting plants, as this hybrid that is just starting to open. Hybrid, a living organism, offspring of two species, vegetatively or by in vitro fertilization. In this case, this Cattleya, which is a hybrid, and that is going to be different to the previous one, it will be larger in size and vigor. It is a Cattleya. Whoever made that crossing named it Long River, because he can definitely do that. When these plants already come with good quality, they reproduce controllably in the laboratory by a tissue crop.
Did you know that in Colombia there are at least 3,000 kinds of orchids and there are some people who insist that there are many more? So our country is and it remains as one of the richest places in orchids. Almost everyone recognizes the large and beautiful Cattleya triana, which is practically a synonym of the orchid by excellence. Because of orchids are developed in a variety of climates and environmental conditions, different species have specific requirements. To succeed in the cultivation of orchids, it's better to know the plants we have, to know their habitat for giving them the closest conditions they will have in real nature. That above all, a good orchid grower must be first a good observer.
From the equatorial zone is where most of the species around the globe are coming off. Two areas of excellence in a variety of natural species. It means native grown and developed in a place. Those aren't in the equatorial zone. Basically, in Latin America and the Pacific Rim, you can talk about countries like Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, Venezuela, Peru, where you can find and locate the greatest deal of orchids in the world. But also at the other end, under the same equatorial zone, we can talk about Borneo Island, the Philippines, where many species are present. As you let us move in the equatorial zone, we also start seeing changes of species, as a variety of plants growing at a sea level. From then on, species start varying. Every time we move away from the Ecuador, we see fewer orchids. For example, in Argentina, you don't see the number of species that you may find in a burrow in Colombia called La Ceja. Not even the whole US have the number of species that another burrow called Warne in Colombia has. But countries with all the problems of climate, like Taiwan, where you can count the native species on a few fingers, it has the highest production of orchids, accompanied with Thailand. But over there, this is possible because institutions and the government contributes actively to make this an industry.
Orchids are herbaceous, durable plants, rarely terrestrial, and generally epiphytes, many of which may be climbing.
In its natural condition, orchids have different ways to grow up. The most popular is the condition of epiphytism. which refers to the plant that grows on a surface, whether it is a tree or a rock, without becoming a parasite. Basically, the food is taken by the plant from everything that falls from the tree or substances which decompose its base in the rain and fall on the bark of the tree. When one uses a wooden trunk and places the plant attached to this piece, the plant takes over that structure and places its roots. It receives its food artificially when I do irrigation in the part where it is attached or tied up. This condition in the crop is also evident in a vase which it has a substrate, very porous, and where the plant will be eventually held. The plant doesn't feed of it. There we see styrofoam, stones, and pieces of bark of the tree. There are some orchids that are terrestrial. There are some purely land, but their presence barely notorious in nature. There are some others that grow above the ground but are not terrestrial. They hold their roots to the soil, but they feed off decomposed leaves, logs, and other plants that fall in the forest. Some of the most famous plants they have in that condition that people look at them as terrestrial are the Epiphytes, or famous shoes, zapatillas. These plants use a substrate that resembles the composition remaining on the soil.
Orchids are different in size, color, and structure of the plant. We can distinguish them by their floral characteristics, among which we can stand 3 sepals, 2 petals, and the leaf.
The complexity of the reproduction of orchids is marked in the adaptations it makes on its flowers for the insects to reach the pollinae this plant has, generally multiple of 3 in petals and sepals. Here we have 2 petals and another one that has been transformed for the insect to catch the message from a very far distance, perceiving that there is something interesting. There are some short paths for the animal to go straight to where the plant has its reproductive system. Reproductive system is fused into a structure called column, where on the most distal part the male organ is located, which is also a very large adaptation if it's compared with other plants. Its pollen, rather than being powder as the rest of the plants, in orchids gets compacted, forming some structures called pollinia. These last ones, in the cattleyas, are located in these structures called anther. They have a special glue which causes the insect to get it stuck. Once it gets it stuck on its back, when it comes back, it leaves the pollen in the female structure, and so the plant gets fertilized. If you can see here, the pollen stayed on the plant, and on a few days later, this material starts traveling through a column and eventually reaches the ovary, which is the bottom that is here. And the pollen fertilizes between 4 and 6 million eggs in there. After 8 months, which is what the whole fertilization and growth of the eggs process lasts, it is capable to take out more or less 4 million seeds that can grow in nature, but under specific conditions really hard to find. From those 4 to 6 million of ovules, 4 to 6 plants get developed in adulthood.
Every time the technique of growing in plastic pots is more common, it is required the use of half-inert sowing composed by pine pieces and also quarry rock. It is the most common system used for the facility of transport.
Additional elements for planting must include a disinfectant for all wounds we may cause to the orchid. The tools to be used in any cut must be sharp and should always be sterilized with fire. It is better if it's intense fire. When you are disinfecting the materials with fire, you have to lower with water the temperature. That helps tempering the metal, otherwise the tool gets damaged easily. In addition, we have to make our choice when the plant is getting out of the previous pot. As you can see, this plant is passing from being small to have a considerable size, but it has already left the container. What is the practical advice for this type of plant, which is a cattleya? Is to count at least 4 bulbs, adults, from the most recent, which is the green you see right here, while others turn to be brown behind the layers that cover it. After that you count 1, 2, 3, 4 at least, and on that part you make a cut. That cut defines me that I leave this plant there for sprouting, and I'll pull out the other plant to plant it in another pot or vase. For this activity, it is essential to have at hand the elements to work without leaving this labor for going to get them, because otherwise you will be wasting precious time to work. I already have my plant. I can leave it right here to produce me another one. But here is where the disinfectant starts taking place, because the wound, as in humans or animals, can be contaminated, and if this happens, the plant may die. What do I do? Is basically to impregnate with the disinfectant, and regarding the wounds, I try just to close them. Now we will proceed with the planting of our new plant, but ideally when you work with this, it's about leave it 3 or 4 days totally still for it to be able to heal its wounds, because if you move it to a different medium, it might have fungi or bacterium. Even if you apply the disinfectant, it is possible for them to enter and damage the plant. With orchids, there is something real necessary you cannot stop doing in this labor, which is the previous label copy to put it in this division and this other division as well. If I lose this label of a hybrid orchid, this plant will have no value for those who go to contests in exhibitions, because this label is essential. The second most important condition is that when you plant it on the new pot or vase, I use a holder or support. This one is wired to hold the plant because if the orchid is moved every time the water falls or the wind blows, the roots of the plant will get damaged and this plant will never be installed right. This labor is not very difficult, but it is necessary because these are two steps that if you don't follow them, you will not have a suitable crop. Once you finish with this process, the oldest part is placed against the most internal part of the pot, so that whenever the plant is taking out a new sprout, this one stays in the pot and it doesn't get out easily. For this, you place the thickest material at the bottom and also the harvest. Then I just need to give a few hits for this substrate to feed the roots. You should only place the substrate until where the bulb begins. This plant must end up with a space of 2 centimeters below the edge of the pot, to prevent it from coming off quickly. After doing this, you put it in a cool place where it will not receive water for 8 days at least. Then you can use vaporization of water and this plant starts the process of giving new roots into the substrate. The situation of orchids in nature is highly vulnerable. Some of them have disappeared. Orchidologists and associations have the task of encouraging studies and supporting population willing to know more about these plants for this to be replicated and reproduced in private collections if it's necessary to move forward with massive crops to repopulate it if it's the case.